Hello, everyone, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Director of Communications at PFLAG National. Great to have you here. And as always, I want to welcome my good friend and colleague and our fearless leader for this gathering, my friend Jean Marie Nevada.
I can't believe I get to do this again. Live long and prosper, Liz.
Am I getting it right? I am.
You got it. I mean, what other job do I get to wear a Star Trek costume and talk about queer stuff? Seriously, PFLAG is the best.
None.
Thanks for somehow allowing me to do this show without flagging why are we doing Star Trek. But
my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Liz. We'll see you in a little while. Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. My pronouns are she and her, or if you speak Spanish, ella. And every single week we get together to talk about something LGBTQ related. And this week, clearly somebody wasn't watching and let me have my way. And we are talking about queers in Star Trek. And I am so excited about this. The Star Trek universe has been known for its work in inclusion for a very long time, whether it has been talking about social justice broadly or racial inclusion, but much more recently, the conversation about LGBTQ inclusion in Star Trek has popped up. And that is definitely what we want to talk about today. We actually started this week with an article that was written about growing up queer and female with Star Trek, which we absolutely love. But of course, because we're PFLAG, we love expanding the conversation much beyond that. And for that, I am bringing in two of my spectacular colleagues, Sean Connors and Leticia Mitchell. Hey, Sean. Hey, Leticia.
Hello.
I'm so excited that you're here to nerd out with me. We've been really looking forward to this. This is like the highlight of the week that we're getting paid to do this conversation for once. So I want to get started because the article was really fascinating. It talked about sort of this queer female perspective, but it's important to know that Star Trek has had its own journey. In fact, Gene Roddenberry was quoted talking about how he actually was not okay with gay and lesbian people for a while, but he had his own ally journey, and it really transformed the way he started to see the world around him. And it was after being called on by some queer fans back in the, I think, late 80s that he started paying attention to how this could happen. But I want to go to the article and talk a little bit about that and then your perspective on it. So the first question that we queued up for this week was, as a Star Trek fan, which both of you are, what do you think of the author's assessment of depiction of queer women in the Star Trek franchise? And are there any episodes that come to mind that you think really drove home some of these portrayals? And Leticia, why don't we start with you?
Okay, great. I actually do think the author is correct in some ways in the assessment, meaning that I think in terms of LGBTQ plus representation, that women actually do actually come out with the fuzzy end of the lollipop in many ways. That it's not the best, actually, and I think that's right. And I think that there is a sort of a nice progression to some better representation throughout the universe itself. And I think that kind of trajectory is right. And now I have some serious disagreement with her in terms of that reading that she gives of 7 of 9 and Rafi. We can get into that a little bit later, but I think overall there's something really wonderful about that, and I think that she's spot on in many ways. So yeah.
Sean, what did you think about sort of the assessment of the characters?
I absolutely agree. I think there has been a sort of natural progression that I've certainly seen as starting as a young person now into adulthood to see how that's paralleled the changes in my own identity and the way that I represent myself in the world. So particularly when she talked about the host episode, I watched that the first time I was probably 10 or 11 years old. And then I watched it after my first breakup. And at the time it was like I was presenting as a woman in a relationship with another woman. And so having that to go back to and go, oh, the reason that I had broken up with this person was because I was trans and I came out to her. And so I had this parallel thing to go back to, and just thinking how things have progressed as I've moved forward in life is so wild, but absolutely.
I think that there were so many different points in Star Trek, especially as, original series, it was done at a very different time. I think it would have been incredibly hard to communicate any of these storylines. I mean, they broke major ground on when they were talking about race and depictions of race, the famous Kirk Uhura kiss. But, at the time, this would have been a really hard one. But by the time we got around to Next Generation, there was, I think, some very coded attempts at trying to be a little bit LGBTQ inclusive. I remember watching The Outcast, which was the one that really stuck with me, and thinking, even at the time, I was in high school at the time, thinking they're trying to talk about people like us, and they're not actually saying it, but I can totally read that this is happening and being really excited about that. But there were a lot of attempts during Next Gen to try to get something off the ground. I mean, there was a famous episode called Blood and Fire, which actually was never made, and people felt that that was sort of an allegory for HIV and AIDS at the time. And so that one sort of sticks out there. I know fans eventually did it. But for either one of you, are there any episodes in the Star Trek universe that I think sort of get to really great examples or close to great examples of queer representation?
Yeah, actually, what I think was interesting in her reading of the Deep Space Nine episode, focusing on Jadzia Dax, was that, she really does keep it squarely in the realm of representations of women, but doesn't really get into and uplift the ways that's also that character. And then what's happening there is also a really lovely sort of representation of trans identity. Right. And there are some things that happen with that character throughout the life of the series. Odu, of course, gets called out a lot. But Jadzia also gets lifted up a little bit. But that would have been a really nice way as a frame to sort of read that as well, because there's a nice duality there. And, it would have brought in some other complications to the way that she is reading that particular episode, the Reunited episode, which is that, it's not just that the other characters around these two characters who get reunited, who find each other again, there's a fear that they will get together, and that, that's some veiled homophobia, but that everybody insists on reading them as women, despite the fact that the Trill are always supposed to have been these very, very complicated sort of characters who inhabit other bodies. And, we're always meant to think of them in these very layered multiple ways. But all of a sudden we get to this particular episode and everybody's very clearly concerned that women just cannot hold it together and they will not be able to control their desires because women get off the chain like that. So there are so many really rich layers there. And I think a nice reading would have teased a lot of that out. I would like to have seen that.
And Sean, anything to add on that with any of the characters that jump out for you? I will reserve my comments about Tasha Yar until the end.
No, I think that's great. I totally agree with you, Leticia. The thing that I was thinking of most was actually in Discovery, how they have sort of this really great representation of chosen family when, with this non-binary character and Anthony Rapp's character with his husband. I think it's just the coolest little chosen family and representation of how we enact ourselves in the world. I do wish there was more representation of queer women in particular in a way that is not that sort of misogynist male gaze kind of view of women that we see represented so often in media, but yeah, it's cool to see how things are changing. And I think it also, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Yeah. Mm-mm.
I think for me, it directly ties into how the production team, historically, people from the cast have become part of the production team moving forward to keep that continuity. And so as we're seeing that focus on women and people of color coming into the production team, as we're expanding the diversity in the Star Trek universe in general, some of these changes I think are reflected because of that.
Yeah, exactly. And one hopes that some of these representations of women, particularly queer women, get to be a little bit better as we move through. Because they're still problematic. There's still things in Discovery that make them a little dicey and a little iffy. And then there's Picard, which is the last, the latest iteration. Which, yeah. But anyway,
I'm not going to talk about right now.
I know, not right now.
I will just say that if anybody missed it, PFLAG did a Parent Day event this past weekend, and we were lucky enough to have Anthony Rapp and Wilson Cruz with us. You can actually watch that on YouTube. But Sean, I thought of them because they mentioned they worked the idea of chosen family into Star Trek. And I thought it was an idea that existed in Star Trek. It very, very much existed. I mean, you could just go to Data, for example, sort of building this family, but then we really put this queer lens over it. And in many ways, that's where this came from. And I thought that was such a great educational opportunity to kind of get that conversation going, which kind of leads perfectly into the second question that we had for this week, which was about the impact of this kind of inclusion. And the question that we were queuing up was, do you think that seeing characters who are queer, seeing characters who are different does have an impact on younger viewers? And more importantly, what do you think more writers can be doing, and what can we be doing to ensure that we see more of this? Because I mean, I think to me, as somebody who was literally raised on Star Trek, who went to, I think I was at the second ever Star Trek convention. I was a tiny little baby, probably not that tiny, but maybe that big. But I mean, it has always been a place to me that was about possibility and about things being better, and that eventually we would evolve to see the world differently and the universe around us differently, this idea of everybody connected. So inherent in that vision was this inclusion thing that even before there were queer characters, I always felt that it was a very safe space for me. And I felt that the fans typically, by and large, were really reflective of that. So Leticia, let's start with you. What do you think about, is there a big impact? Do you think there's an impact? And what are those kind of things that we can be doing to ensure that this happens the right way?
Yeah, I do actually think that there is a huge impact. I think it's hugely impactful. And that is, if nothing else, it opens up imaginative space. And particularly if you're a younger person, you are looking for ways to think more expansively about your own identity and how you want to move through the world. And so, yes, you know, it's not just that because these are questions that are being attached to a story that is a futurist sort of universe and narrative, you know, and you're thinking about versions of your future self, but you also just want something rich, someone to give you as many possibilities as possible for what you can do and what you can be. And so absolutely, I think it is important for LGBTQ plus inclusion to have this as a younger viewer. And I think it's really fantastic. And even if it's, you know, we're talking about, you know, we're getting on some of the things that make it a little bit messy and whatnot, what have you, that's fine. Because even if you recognize those places where it's uneven or it's a little messy, it's even the ability to recognize that is already saying something about where you are in your journey. And I think that's also a great thing too. In terms of, you know, action items, because I love what you always say, Jean Marie, PFLAG is about action. So I think one of the things that's fascinating to me is there are very rich message boards and groups that are having really good conversations and want to see things move forward. However, the ones that we always hear about are the ones that have a very negative message, or that say that we aren't being really true to, you know, whoever roots and the blah, blah, blah. Those are the ones we hear. And I don't understand why we have to listen to those when there is also this very, very rich conversation that's happening. I think there is something that's already happening. It's just that for whatever reason, we aren't listening to those particular voices. And those are the ones, if, you know, studios and creators are looking for ways to strengthen their convictions, I don't understand why they aren't lifting up those places. So.
Yeah. And Sean, what do you think? Because I mean, you and I both talked about sort of these moments of watching Next Gen as young people and sort of having that, oh my gosh, I'm there. So I'm guessing that you do see the impact, but also what do you think is important in terms of shaping what we eventually see on screen? Because we know fans have a huge role in that.
I think, to Leticia's point too, I think there's a really great natural pathway, particularly with like shows that have a wide following, like Star Trek does in such a long breadth of existence, right? So taking that original ethos of like the era of the space race and kind of moving that forward into now, where in the digital age we have this almost live stream to Mars. How do we continue that sort of trajectory with Star Trek as well? I think that a really cool way that people could do that would be more like encouraging more fanfic. I think that there's a super strong pathway for that anyways. You know, we know that there's some of the novels are based on fanfic. And so continuing to shore up those pipelines would be really great. I also think that as consumers of media, we have to be really intentional about how the shows that we're supporting and choosing to support, and the feedback that we're choosing to give as the consumers and as the people who are really driving the franchise to grow it and hold people accountable to building that diversity as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think, you know, there is that story about Gene Roddenberry being confronted by a group of queer fans who questioned him and sort of forced the issue, and he made a commitment to them. And unfortunately, he passed away before the first character ever was introduced. But I think the fact that fans got that conversation going, and that is part of the reason that it remained part of the narrative and the discussions as the different episodes and the different series developed, it was because of what fans did. It wasn't just because of some sort of magical external force. So I want to get into the last question, which was the one that I was actually most excited about, even though admittedly I did want to battle out our favorite female characters. There may still be time for that, which is, and I'm going to read this one verbatim because I think this is something that a lot of us think about a lot and we talk about a lot when we're talking about creative stuff. So the question is this: what, if anything, would you recommend to content creators that are trying to avoid grand gestures of LGBTQ plus inclusion without being accused of queer baiting or the blink and you miss it moments in the way that some other franchises have? Because there have been some really bad examples of this through the years. And I mean, so bad that we actually lift them up as, remember when that happened, and everyone cringes. So Leticia, we'll start with you and then go over to Sean. What are your suggestions on this one? I know this is one of your favorite topics.
Yes, absolutely. And this actually does bring me back to this week's article and the places where I disagree with the author's reading of the relationship that sort of builds in the very last moments between 7 of 9 and the Rafi character, which is there had been absolutely no buildup. You missed an absolutely wonderful opportunity to have this relationship develop in a series that is 13 episodes of a single arc of a single story. You could have also had a relationship develop, a romantic relationship develop throughout that. That doesn't necessarily have to be coming out. It is two mature female characters. And that would have also been, you would have ticked a lot of boxes if you had done that. Just don't miss these opportunities, because then when they get together, I was sort of like, they got together because there was a stage direction in the script. I'm not convinced that that was an authentic relationship. Somebody focus grouped that and then threw that in there. I'm just like, because they're like, oh, we're going to solve this issue with 7 of 9. This whole backstory that that's been going on, is she or is she not, for years and years and years. And we're just going to do it in a couple of scenes and thank you and call it done. That is in no way satisfying. So if you want to do something as a content creator, give it life, give it breath. Because, as our colleague Jamel said in a few broadcasts back, like, you asked him, what is it that you want to see? And it's sort of like, I want to see characters fall in love. I want that luxury as someone who is LGBTQ. So yes.
I so wish it hadn't been 7 of 9. I have to admit that to you, because 7 of 9 was so hyper-sexualized. I was like, oh, of course you're going to put her with a girl. I mean, like, I would have loved to do something that felt a little bit less obvious, a little bit less like a fulfillment of some sort of like weird guy fantasy that could have happened. And it just didn't happen that way. And I totally agree with you, Leticia. I'm going to stop talking before I get in so much trouble. Sean, stop me. Please say something smart. Hurry.
I'll try. So I think that one of the things that I hope for more of in the future is the ability to just have LGBTQ characters living their lives beyond building those romantic relationships, but also, like, what does it mean? What does it look like to transition in the Star Trek universe? Like, what does it look like to transition and then also go back to doing your job at whatever job you do, and it has nothing to do with your identity, right? So those normal everyday interactions of just existing. I think often my go-to example of this is actually Brooklyn Nine-Nine, like the police chief in that. He happens to be gay, but that's like no part of his role pretty much, right? And that's what I want for Star Trek.
Yeah. When I think about just sort of making it part of the conversation, I think about going back to Next Gen, when Data creates Lal, and Lal is asked, what do you want your gender presentation to be? It was just part of it. It wasn't sort of this standout moment. It didn't grandstand. It just was part of the conversation. It was the same reason that I was very frustrated by suddenly officially making Sulu a gay character. I'm like, oh, thanks for adding that on at the last minute. We deserve a whole lot more than like a quick shot, the blink and you miss it with your husband and kid kind of thing. I'm way complaining. I am looking at people who are making comments, and we are seeing a lot of people talk about the importance of having queer content creators. And I think that's a really big piece of this conversation. I am not just a science fiction, a Star Trek fan, but I'm a huge Doctor Who nerd. And I still think one of the reasons we got interesting queer characters in Doctor Who was because of Russell T Davies, who happens to be a gay man, who was the showrunner who brought the series back originally. And I think that's so important. So what can you give some examples of other places where you think sci-fi is getting it right? Are we seeing any places where this is happening, or where we think there are some opportunities? Look at me making up questions as we go along. Oh my goodness, we have no examples?
Don't.
We don't? Well, I'm looking in the chat, and I'm starting to, somebody mentioned, Pose is a good example, but that is part of my thing here, that I think we are really lacking a lot of good examples in the sci-fi universe that are sort of generating this conversation, that we see characters who kind of occasionally get coded. And Sean, I think you mentioned something really important about fan fiction too, and what has happened in those spaces. Can you talk a little bit about what you have seen people do? Because I think a lot of the creators there too tend to skew a little bit younger, and we're seeing some interesting stuff pop up. So do you think that has created spaces where people are able to maybe build what is not being built for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of us want to see ourselves represented. And so if we are those kind of folks who are more creative, we're certainly tend to be in those circles and building those relationships with other people, thinking forward about how we would have written it, right? And so, I mean, I'm not somebody who writes fanfic, but I've read a lot. And it's interesting to see the different avenues that people take, and then thinking about how it would fit back into the official sort of breadth of information that people build out.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things that's sort of tangential to this is that, this is something that exists with a lot of ongoing, universes that people have, is sort of like how to be included in that ongoing universe and how to be represented well. And there isn't as much of a push, I feel like, to create something new. And maybe it really what we should be doing is making the push to create the universe that is the way we want it to be from the ground up, right? And so there's so much energy is gone into how can we do better in this particular, so Star Trek or whatever it is, Star Wars, which had its own, whole host of issues around that, and then finally just decided to not do a thing at all, right? Star Trek is trying to do a thing at the very, very least, but yeah. So it really, I think that would actually be really nice. And so when we're calling for queer content creators, it is actually give us new content, and let's make the push for how can we make sure that gets elevated and made and greenlit, I think might be a real thing too.
I think that, I'm looking in the chat. I just saw Toby mentioned maybe all the actors and actresses featured on Disclosure, which is a great documentary, should get into sci-fi, because there is a real shortage of trans actors and actresses, and you just have to find them. It's not that people don't exist. It's that people maybe haven't been tapped for this. And I think it's when we have actual actors who have had lived experiences that we tend to see these shows come out differently. And I think there is an authenticity to say it, that not to say that somebody can't play queer. Certainly you can, in the same way a queer person can play not queer. God, that's a weird statement. But I think that we start to see sort of a different lens to it. And I think we've seen this. I know that some of the stuff that I've watched on Netflix has we've started to see this happening a little bit more. And I also, Leticia, I really appreciate your point that we need to build these characters from the ground up. And I think that remains one of the challenges in a universe that constantly is trying to reinvent itself. I'm also going to say that I believe that very quietly you did establish that Star Trek is better than Star Wars.
And then not so quietly, but anyway. There are.
Thank you. There's Jamie Henkel's comment. I thought Sense8, which was one of the examples that had just popped into my head, was a great example. Although sometimes it almost went a little bit too far. I felt that people spend a lot of time talking about the obvious things in our lives in ways that we don't. But I guess you do have to support the narrative. All right. So then we're going to have to spend the last few minutes of this time talking about the question that we all need to do, which was, who were the queerest characters in Star Trek?
So, yeah, I mean, Tasha Yar. We have to. Yes. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So.
Tasha Yar. We'll just stop there. Although I'm going to put in a big plug for, I felt like B'Elanna Torres had a lot of potential in Voyager, but we were all really super focused on Seven of Nine and frankly Janeway, who was just bossy. It wasn't lesbianism. It was just flat out bossiness. I can say that I'm a lesbian, so.
Well, look, the reason that we, are compelled to read Janeway that way is because we have this very narrow understanding and vision of what lesbianism, lesbianism is. So yes, of course.
John, jump in before Leticia and I both get ourselves fired.
Cosine Tasha Yar all day long, but I also want to make the argument for Q. Especially from a camp perspective and like maybe a drag kind of culture
Speak to us about this one.
He's just so extra in a way that reads Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence to me. Like, it's just very showy and sort of chaotic in a way that reminds me of Pride a lot.
Reminds me of Pride a lot. Being to different universes and taken out of the place that you are feels exactly like a Pride parade to me. I want to make an argument for Garak, the tailor in Deep Space Nine. And I read an interesting thing that the actor who was playing him said that he actually intentionally played up his attraction to Dr. Bashir, sort of hoping that some fans would read the character that way, which I thought was really neat and kind of subversive. But I also found it to be terribly tragic because I was like, they couldn't have just said what this character was. The actor had to kind of suggest it. And I think I started to find it getting a little bit frustrating, and that kind of unnerved me a little bit. Any other ones that we want to bring up while we still have our time?
The only reason I'm going to mention Guinan, which is Whoopi Goldberg's character, is just because now this happens off screen, but she completely shut down a storyline in which, she's telling her adopted child about what love is and about what human connection is and about what a romantic relationship is. And they wanted it to be focused on, they wanted it to be a very heteronormative sort of understanding of that. And she shut that down and she said, we need to be beyond that. Thank you. And I'm not interested. And so I just, all of that I loved. So, yeah.
Well, I think that also speaks to the importance of having really well-informed allies working in this space too. That obviously not all of the creators are queer, but when we have allies who are flagging some of these conversations, flagging some of this dialogue and saying, hey, it doesn't need to necessarily look like this, we have a lot of potential. I mean, let's face it, probably most of the Star Trek content was not created by people who are queer, and yet all of us can read strong queer themes into it. Yeah. So it probably speaks to this, this real importance of making sure that our allies are engaged and feeling empowered to do this. When we look at the new Star Trek work, and I'm specifically looking at Discovery, I want to ask you both, because I know that you've both been watching, do you think that they got it right? Do you think that this was the way to introduce these characters to the universe? Because it came with a tremendous amount of fanfare and everybody was really excited. And I understand that with that much fanfare comes a very brutal lens sometimes. So where did it go wrong? Where do we want to see a little bit more? I have no opinions. No.
Stop it. You do have opinions about it. You have opinions about everything. And I'm a queen of opinions. No, I think it does get some things right. And I do think the relationship between Wilson Cruz's character and Anthony Rapp's character, that I think is handled with a lot of sensitivity and with a lot of care. And I really love that. And then the way that they are able to then build on that and then have this idea of chosen family and the way that non-binary characters get introduced into this family union. I just think there's some really lovely things there. As I mentioned at the top, the things that happen with the women are and forever will be frustrating. It is, I still don't see them on Discovery getting away from a male gaze when it comes to these characters, and so it is always the sort of vision of wanting to imagine women being together so that men can imagine themselves in a threesome there. That's still, sort of, it seems to me what's driving that.
Sean?
Yeah, and I would add to that too, oftentimes because people are sort of coding non-binary and trans characters as effeminate or more femme than masculine, there's something more there that I would want too.
I think that's sort of fascinating. I've wondered about that, and I've still sort of been wondering, am I overreading into things? Am I being a little bit too demanding here? Now that you've given me this much, I want this much. But I'm glad that you raised it, because I think, and I don't see any of this as criticism. I literally see all of this as the way that we push these conversations forward and we get it better next time, because we have to talk about it, because I think there are so many ways that we are starting to see this in different ways. My friends, thank you so much for giving me one 30-minute block of pure nerding out in the name of our actual jobs. This was so much fun. We have to find a reason to do it again.
Thank you, Jean Marie. Always happy to be here. Love hanging out with Sean. I miss you at the office. So
Thank you.
Thank you, Leticia. Thank you, Sean. Thank you so much. And that wraps up another show for us this week. Next week, we begin our Pride Month series. So we've got some good stuff in store. So until next week, obviously live long and prosper. But as we close every single week, make sure that you run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, be kind. We will see you next week. If you need help, please visit us at pflag.org. Have a safe and happy week, everybody. Bye.